So we are very happy to have our third plenary speaker tonight, who is Larry Christiano, and Pat Kehoe is going to introduce him.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to introduce Larry. I had a nice chat with him this afternoon. I was asking him about some of his early intellectual influences, and he reminded me about that. So if you know, Larry has a PhD from Columbia, and he's now an Alfred Chase Chair Professor at Northwestern. And in terms of some of the early influences, he reminded me of how he got started. So he was a Columbia grad student, and he was working with Taylor. And as he described it, he was doing just okay. Then he ran into a set of circumstances to Tom Sargent, who asked him to work with him at the Minneapolis Fed. And he brought him out to the Minneapolis Fed for 2 years, and he turned into his career around, as he said, and he got a job at the Chicago Business School. So the first link with Minnesota I want to emphasize is he's one of the first graduates of the Minneapolis Fed training program for grad students, of which Lars Hansen and a whole list of most macroeconomists you've heard of are also members. Then once he got out, he did well. He went to Chicago B School for his first job, but then as he described it this morning, he was doing just okay, getting his feet under him, trying to get some research done. He went there for 4 years, and it was like a lot of us, like I had a very slow start. He had a slow start, and he went to Carnegie for a year. Then he had a second visit to the Minneapolis Fed, in which Larry called spectacularly important to his career. He was into time aggregation bias when he first started, and I talked to him, I think I was a brand new assistant when I met him, and I was saying, yeah, okay. And then he came, and through a series of discussions with everybody, some more painful than others, some teasing, some other, through 7 years of working at the Minneapolis Fed, he switched from being primarily interested in statistical methods to having a deep and abiding love of business cycles. I had the good fortune to work with him and Chari and a couple on fiscal policy and monetary policy, and at the same time, you got interested and worked a lot with Marty Eichenbaum. And in those 7 years, he established some tools and papers and knowledge that eventually led him to become a leader in business cycle research. And he established himself and kept going for the next 30 years. And he was, I'd call maybe a founding member and a participant in what I call the Minneapolis Fed Rejuvenation Program. What I mean by that, it was a smart person doing some good stuff, but he needed a time to think in a nice place with good colleagues. And he was one of the first guys, he and Shari actually, I think, were some of the first two guys, who came there and they took a chance. At that time, Minneapolis Fed was not very academic. It was mainly a standard old Fed. And then through Art Ronick, Larry, Shari, and others, it sort of took off. Larry, after 7 years, became a professor at Northwestern. Shari, after 7 or 8 years, became a professor at Northwestern. And they sort of laid the groundwork with Art of this continued. And Hal Cole came, 7 years later became a professor at UCLA. Klenow came for 4 or 5 years after being fired from the Chicago Fed, then went to Stanford. Now he's going everywhere. Kachi Lakota was struggling at Iowa. Sometimes he forgets that, and Art Ronick reached out, him out of obscurity, helped give a good environment. Then he eventually became a professor at Minnesota, then Stanford, and then some other place he is now. And then Ellen is one of our last graduates. She was there for a lot of years. She came from Duke, spent a lot of years there. Now she's a new chair professor at University of Minnesota. So that was a great program. Larry's one of the starters and key participants, and I want to say thanks a lot. You're not ready. A second thing he started that people forgot, he started this thing called the Institute of Empirical Macro, and now it's just called the Visiting Program at the Fed, but he got an NSF grant and got some funding from the Fed, and then for 10 years, 15, now it's been going on 25 years, and it's been hundreds of macroeconomists come through the Fed for 1, 2, 3 weeks, months, et cetera, through this institute that he started with Art Ronick, and that was wonderful. And we hope that even with our most recent difficulties, that the tradition of the rejuvenation program and the Institute of Empirical Macro will keep going and continue to prosper. Now let me turn to his talk. I really don't know the whole talk. I know it's about the Great Recessions. And I'll just say that Larry's gotten bolder from his early days to his later days. When he was young and we were working together, we talked a lot about the shocks, and we put in things like TFP shocks and government spending shocks. And now as he gets older, he's a little bit less constrained in his views of shocks in the world. And now I think the names of some of his shocks will be flight to quality shocks and taste for bond shocks. But I do believe in programming, and so if you take a program and you loosen the constraints, the welfare goes up. So since he loosed his constraints in interpretation of shocks, he can add more stuff. I'm sure that our welfare will go up relative to the old view. And with that, here you go, Larry.
Well, thanks very much for this. First of all, for the invitation to give this talk. It's a great honor. And also, thank you, Pat, for the things that you said. The truth is that I did learn everything I know about economics. I learned at during this 7-year period at the Minneapolis Fed, and it was primarily from Pat and from Chari, from working with those two guys, is where I learned all the stuff. So I'm a little nervous now. I feel a little like the student in front of his professor, and I hope this works. So this paper I'm going to talk about is joint with Marty Eichenbaum and Matthias Trabant. The title is Understanding the Great Recession. As you'll see, I think a better title would be something like Accounting for, or Finding Shocks that account for the Great Recession. Let me begin with the background for this study. So the first thing is that, I'm not sure how I'm going to do this. I think I'll stand a little like here. The first thing that we know is that in the last several years, GDP has been down, maybe by as much as 10% relative to trend, which means that over 5 years or 6 years, we've lost half a 1 year's GDP over this period. We see there's a trend decline in labor force participation. But the interesting thing is that just when the recession supposedly was over in 2009, labor force participation decline accelerated. We saw that the unemployment rate went way up. It did come down a little bit, but arithmetically it's entirely because of the decline in the labor force participation rate. It's not because workers are getting absorbed more efficiently into the labor market. Related to this is the employment to population ratio has fallen, and it doesn't look like it's coming up again. Another thing is the Beveridge curve. I guess I don't have the graph, so I'll just act it out. This is vacancies over here, and there's unemployment. So what happened is that vacancies came down, unemployment went up. And then what happened was that vacancy just started going up, but unemployment didn't kind of go down by the amount that you would have predicted based on this thing here. So it's kind of going up like this. And so that is made people think that maybe part of the decline in employment has something to do with some sort of a breakdown in the labor market. Finally, the last sort of observation I'd like you to have in mind is that we have that investment and consumption are both very, very low during this period. So we have a couple of questions that we want to ask. One is, what were the key forces driving all of this stuff? Another one is, what role, if any, did mismatch or structural breakdown in the labor market play in these observations? Another thing is that one of the things we observe in the last few years is that you see a fall in inflation, but it's relatively small. It's about 1%, 1.5%, or something like that. The problem is the unemployment rate went way up. And last time that happened, in 1982, the inflation rate just plummeted. But now it's coming down very low. So there's a kind of a puzzle in this among these data, which is why was the drop in inflation so moderate? Okay, so to get at these questions, we obviously need a model, because we have a lot of moving parts involved in answering this question. I want to see how I want to see them in an environment where they're kind of meshed together properly. The model obviously has to address some of the words that I've been talking about. So, for example, better have a lot of stuff about the labor market: employment, labor force participation rate, job finding rate. I want to say something about the Beveridge curve, and so on. And of course, I also want the meat and potatoes of macro, which is I want output, consumption, and investment in the model. Now, this model is going to have to really specialize on the labor market because so many conversations about this phenomenon end up talking about the labor market. So one of the things we do is, in some sense, the model is pretty standard, the whole model that we use, but we kind of innovate on the labor market side of this. In particular, it's clear that we're going to have to endogenize labor force participation because it's the movement in the labor force participation that partially accounts for the for the fall in the unemployment rate. And so labor force participation is moving in a funny way. We want to have that. The other thing is that the minute we start talking about the labor market, we come into contact with the fundamental and classic problem in macro. Problem goes back to Lucas and Rapping, I guess, which is how do you get labor market variables to actually move? So in the typical macro model, you have the following property. When a shock occurs, I don't know what it is, that launches an expansion in the economy, what typically happens is you get a pretty sharp rise in the wage, and as a consequence, firms have little incentive to hire more people. It's this rise in the wage that causes firms not to want to hire more people. In models with unemployment, it causes the unemployment rate not to fall very much, and so on. In recent times, this is called the Scheimer puzzle. In the RBC literature, this was just the employment puzzle. Employment didn't move around. In literature with shirking, you have the same basic problem that you have to address, and it's fundamental to us because the phenomenon we're trying to explain is a phenomenon in which there's a lot of movements in employment and unemployment and so on. So we have to in a sense address that if we're going to build a labor market side for our model. We're uncomfortable with, there is a natural solution to the problem of how to get employment to fluctuate a lot, which is you just pass a law that says you're not allowed to change the wage. And this is why, for example, in the New Keynesian literature where you have sticky wages, there's no discussion of this puzzle. It was an obsession in the real business cycle literature. It's an obsession in other literature. No discussion about this volatility of labor markets in the New Keynesian model. Why is that? Well, because by law, the wage rate was kept constant. Now, for various reasons, that strikes me as an unappealing solution to the thing. And so when we build our labor market side to the model, we are going to build it in such a way that, yes, the wages don't rise all of a sudden, but that's going to be for endogenous reasons. We will not have anything about sticky wages in the model. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this model. I'm not going to be able to describe the whole thing to you, but I'll describe the labor market part of it. Even that, not in great detail, but kind of give intuition about it. Then what I'm going to do is get the parameters for the model from the pre-2008 data, and then armed with the model, armed with values for the parameters, I'm going to march into the Great Recession period and try to understand that. Okay, so I told you the questions we're interested in, and I'll give you an advance warning about the answers that we find. So the first question was, what forces drove the real quantities in the Great Recession? And the answer that we come up with is basically two shocks, or two I guess wedges are the best word for this. Two shocks, I'll call it, to financial markets were the key drivers of everything, including the labor force participation rate. The first one I want to call a flight to quality shock, which is a perturbation in people's intertemporal Euler equation. In the intertemporal Euler equation for the risk-free asset. So I guess that's why it's called flight to quality, because it looks like there's a preference shock for a risk-free asset. One of the reasons we do this is Jonas Fisher sort of has a little nice example that shows how that perturbation looks like people like risk-free assets, like U.S. government debt more. The other shock is a financial. Another shock is a wedge in the intertemporal Euler equation for capital accumulation. That thing has been discussed a lot. I'll go into more detail later. But those two things Those two things are the two things that seem to account for most of the movements in the real quantities. We will use the data to restrict the financial wedge. We're going to look at credit spreads, and we're going to interpret the credit spreads as indicators of the size of that financial wedge. The flight to quality shock we're going to make up. That's going to be our free parameter. We have the free parameter, which is this shock. All the other shocks in the model are going to be kind of observable shocks, but not the flight to quality. We're going to have 4 shocks, and a flight to quality financial wedge. So the answer to the question, what are the main drivers? It's those two things. The other question, was there mismatch in the labor market? Well, no. We don't need to know. We don't need to have any mismatch in the labor market to understand what we saw. This thing that people interpret as a shift in the beverage curve, this cycling business, actually occurs quite naturally in a model with search and matching. This observation was made by Pissarides, but it comes out really quantitatively. It comes out quantitatively important in in understanding the Great Recession period. Another shock that we have is government consumption. We were very interested in knowing, does the behavior of government consumption have much to do with the dynamics of the recession? The answer is no. We find that it has essentially it's not part of the picture. It might have been a part of the picture had they made it bigger or smaller or something. But the variation in government consumption, though it appears large, actually, if you just look at it in a graph, from the point of view of our model, that's not part of the picture. This question here, why was inflation drop so moderate? Well, the answer to that is a simple one. We find reasons to think that costs went up during this period. Even though the economy is collapsing, we find reason to think that costs... And there are two. One is, if you look at the TFP data, you see that TFP goes down, and that raises costs. And the other thing is that following. In our environment, there's also what you call a labor wedge, which is for firms to hire workers, they have to borrow money in advance. And we imagine that to do that, if they have to borrow, they have to pay interest, but not just any old interest. They have to pay the high interest rates that we saw during this period. And those interest rates are sufficiently high such that combined with the observed slowdown in TFP, we have no problem explaining the modest fall in inflation. Okay, so let me get into the model, but the main discussion about the model is going to be about the labor market. So here it is. The labor market has to be a 3-state labor market. We have to, typically in models, we have 2 states. You're either employed or not employed. We need 3 states. We need to also have the state of non-participation because part of the problem is to understand why the non-participators are growing in number during the Great Recession. So we have a model with these 3 states, and we have all these flows going in all these various directions. As you know, the gross flows are enormous, and in our model, we roughly kind of match those gross flows. Of course, we're interested really in the net flows. But anyway, we have a model like this with everybody running around in all sorts of directions. You have people going from non-participation to employment right away. You have some going from non-participation to unemployment. From the point of view of employment, you have some people leaving employment and going to non-participation, blah, blah, blah. And then you also have some people going from employment to employment. That's the arrow that kind of comes back on top of each other. Now, there are 2 basic forces that occur in the labor market that I need to talk about using this picture here. The first one is the endogeneity of participation, or I should say non-participation, of those people in the bottom right. The question is, how is it decided to get people to move from non-participation into the market, and how is it decided to move fewer people in there, more people in there? And the answer to that is given, the beginnings of the answer is given by that stuff up there. We have a model with complete insurance in the labor market. In my view, that's a very bad assumption. I don't think we have complete insurance. I also think that in about 4 years, working in models with complete insurance will no longer be acceptable, even in big models like what I'm talking about, because there's tremendous progress in the thinking about labor markets with incomplete insurance, even in general equilibrium environments, occurring now. Actually, a bunch of it is being developed by people in this room, and there's some sessions at this conference about that. But for now, I'm going to deal with the complete insurance environment. And I don't really know how incomplete insurance would affect the basic conclusions that I'm going to reach. But anyway, we have complete insurance, which means that each household in the economy looks like every other household and has lots of family members in it. Actually, the three types of people are in the household. And the household's utility is something called C tilde. And C tilde, which is home consumption, is produced using a production function which uses as inputs market consumption, the CT. CT is the purchase of market consumption goods, and CTH, which is the consumption produced at home. You'll see there's no subtraction for leisure costs up there. And this paper is actually not quite finished yet. We're still struggling to understand exactly what that means. Here's my conjecture, or the way I think about it, but it may be wrong. It may be. So the idea is that what we have here is that actually we should think of there as being a minus constant for the effort that these people make. So what's the effort? Well, the people who are working, they're busting their butts working. So that's effort. The people who are not participating in this model, they're also working. They're making the home-produced good. And we imagine those efforts are kind of the same. The people who are unemployed, they're, of course, making efforts as well. They're looking for a job. But we know that they don't make a lot of effort on that. They mainly eat chocolates rather than looking for a job. But I could imagine that various things, that the assumption that the cost of being an unemployed person is kind of similar to the other two could be defended. I'm not going to try and do that now. But under those circumstances, which circle you're in doesn't make any difference from the point of view of the pain that you suffer in order to make an effort. I want to think about that there's a minus something to the right of that utility function, but that something is a constant. And as I reallocate people across these different circles, the suffering that they do, the natural life suffering that they experience, is roughly the same for everybody. Okay, so the production function for the home-produced goods is going to involve only 1 minus L. L is the labor force, so 1 minus L is the non-participating people. The production of the home good will be exclusively done by the non-participating people, and of course the people who are employed are the ones who are making the earnings that make it possible to buy CT. Both of these types of people are contributing to utility in the household. The household makes the usual has a usual kind of budget constraint. Expenditures have to be less than or equal to income. The L minus L, the big L minus little l is the unemployed people. They get a payment from the government. And then the little l people, they're the ones who are working. They get a wage. And then there's some kind of a bond and borrowing. And then there's T for whatever taxes are going on in this economy. So the decision about the labor force participation is kind of the natural one I think that economists think about, which is there's work going on in the home, there's work going out in the market, produce gains, and so as one or the other gets more or less attractive, you move away from the unattractive option. And that's going to be the story about why the labor force participation rate is going down so much in this model, is because the job finding rate and the wage rate in the model, as in the data, are low. Okay, so that's one force in the labor market. Now, there's another force in the labor market, which is the wage. The wage is like really important. It's central to when you build a model. The wage, what happens to the wage, is very, very important. Not per se, because who cares about the wage per se, but it's important because it's the key to understanding the volatility of labor market variables like unemployment and employment. So that's the second thing I want to talk about in this context. Now, what we imagine in this world is that the firms and the workers, they meet. When they meet, they bargain, and then possibly they form a match, and then they work. The people who are bargaining, there are a variety of ways of thinking about that in an environment. Most of you know this. There's many different ways of arranging things that give rise to the same equilibrium allocations for consumption and so on. But the one I'll just do, for specificity, I'm going to imagine that everybody bargains all the time. So if I have a job with a particular firm, every morning we meet and we bargain and we agree on a wage. If I'm someone who arrived from another job and I just met this firm, I meet and I bargain for a wage. If I'm coming from non-participation, I meet, I bargain. I come from unemployment, I meet and I bargain. The bargaining is going to be everybody's bargaining. Okay, now let's get into that a little bit. We're going to adopt the approach that Hall and Milgram suggested. They were specifically concerned with this problem that economists need the wage to move less because, well, partly wages don't seem to move very much. And secondly, because with a smaller movement in wages, you have more opportunity to explain the observed volatility of labor market variables. So very quickly tell you what this framework looks like. Now, the first line is actually a lie because that's not Hall and Milgram, but whatever. So I'm now going to describe the environment. How does a meeting occur? The meeting occurs, the firm pays a fixed cost, and then it meets. At the time that the bargaining begins after the meeting, the fixed cost is sunk. It becomes irrelevant. But they pay a price. Oh, there it goes. Right. So they also have to post vacancies, but the vacancies per se are costless. The vacancies are just, I call you up, hey John, I got a job opportunity. It costs me nothing to do that. Or I put a notice on the web. That costs nothing to post, but you have to post vacancies because how else is he going to know? So you have to post vacancies, but the actual resources you allocate to grabbing somebody is you pay $10 or something. Okay, then what happens, now we accomplished a meeting, then what happens is we begin the alternating offer bargaining. I'm not going to go through the details of the alternating offer bargaining, but I want to give you the basic idea. One of the nice things about all of this stuff is that it requires so much specificity, and this is what we call structural modeling. The beauty of structural modeling, as opposed to just imposing things exogenously, is that when you do structural modeling, you're shown how to go to other data sets that are probably not the ones you're looking at here to flesh out what it is, or possibly to reject what you're talking about, or possibly flesh it out. So let's talk about this in a little bit more than zero detail. So these people get together, and just like in any search and matching environment, they both understand there's surplus to be had. They both understand that if they could just get together and work, it would be really cool. They know this because the firm has already checked you out before. They know they're not just interviewing with any old idiot. They're somebody that could put down. And the worker who's bargaining with the firm has checked the firm out too and thinks, hey, that might be a cool. So everybody knows that there's rent. They're better off reaching an agreement than going apart. Now comes Hall and Milgram, which is if there's a disagreement, the understanding is that because this is such a nice thing that we could do together, if there happens by accident to be a disagreement, we are not going to storm out of the room in a huff, insulting each other. We're going to sit down and try to work out an agreement. In particular, we're going to continue negotiations. So that's step number 2 in the Hall and Milgram. Now comes step number 3, which is, now that we're thinking about this bargaining process, if that bargaining process is sufficiently isolated from the rest of the world. Let's take the example that I think is called in the hut bargaining. Imagine we were bargaining in a hut which is made out of lead and it's impervious. It does not allow any information about unemployment, nothing about the other outside world can come into this hut. And we're sitting here bargaining. Then it has to be that the outcome of the bargain, namely the wage, is independent of what's going on in the rest of the world. So that's the basic idea. Now we have to describe the environment. We can't have literally in the hut bargaining because that's ridiculous. First of all, wages are pro-cyclical. They move around. They seem to respond to the state of the economy and so on. But this is the basic insight that they had. Now, let me talk about how we get sort of this thing going. So following them, actually this goes back to Benmore, Walensky, and Rubenstein. In the alternating offer bargaining, when the firm receives an offer from the worker, the firm has the right to reject the offer and propose a counteroffer. Consequence of that would be that the firm suffers a cost gamma. And the key thing about that cost gamma is there's no time subscript on it. That's the key thing. That's what makes it insulated from the rest of the world. There's no time subscript. If that gamma had a time subscript on it and it was proportional to the rest of the economy, pro-cyclical, then the whole damn enterprise sinks into the waves. So there is a feature of the environment which is not connected to the rest of the world, which promotes the outcome that the wage bargain isn't too sensitive to the rest of the world. Now, you don't want the whole thing, you don't want literally in the bargaining. So we have a lot of other forces that impact on the bargaining and therefore the wage. Because there's a bunch of costs associated with bargaining that actually directly link to the business cycle. For example, in the alternating offer bargaining situation, the longer you bargain, everybody's losing. Time is going by, valuable time in which you could be producing. And in a boom, that's more valuable than in a recession. And that's true from the point of view of both sides. The other thing is we also, following Rubin, Hall and Milgram, but then the earlier papers, we also imagine that if you say, the wage offer you just made me is not good enough for me because I'm a very important person, so I'm rejecting your offer, but I'm coming tomorrow with a counteroffer. In this environment, there's a chance that when I show up tomorrow with my counteroffer, you're not there anymore. So there's a probability delta that the negotiations break down. And of course, that's another example of how the outside world kind of leaks in through this hut that they're bargaining in. And it turns out that all of these things kind of work. They're enough to get the wage to be less flexible so that you get enough flexibility in unemployment and so on. Another I think an important way to convey the environment is to tell you how everybody feels about things in this model. The three people, there are only three people. There's the people in E, in the non-participation, and in the unemployment. What are their value functions look like? This is the value function. This is the value that a firm assigns to a match when the wage rate is W. And that var theta thing there is, wait. So what's going on in this market is that a worker makes one thing, a widget or something. One worker makes one thing, and the one thing has a market price of that var theta thing there. It looks a lot like a productivity shock, and in fact, kind of is in the context of this little labor market thing here. So the value of a worker to the firm is what the worker brings in, what the widget that the worker makes brings in, minus the wage, plus, there's a typo, there should be a rho there because the rho is the persistence of a job, and that's a dynamic representation of the firm value. Here's the worker to get a feel for this environment. So this is the value of a matched worker getting a wage W. Remember, the wage is determined by alternating offer bargaining. Imagine that they now have the wage W, and you can see that the flow in the current period from the worker is W. So one question is, well, where does that come from? And the answer is the following. The workers are instructed, see, this is perfect insurance, so they don't care about anything. They suffer, they're miserable no matter where they are. If they're working at home making cookies, they're working in the market, they're miserable. It's all painful and unpleasant. And whatever they do, they get the same level of consumption in the evening. So what is being done to incentivize people? The answer is the household instructs everyone to care about the value of what it is they get, to care about the marginal utility to the household of what they get. These workers, the only thing they do, they don't contribute anything to baking or cooking at home. They only bring in a wage. So we have the value of what they bring in is the wage. And then you have all the various things that can happen when you have a three-state economy. You can remain employed, you can become separated and find a job right away, you can become separated and you can become unemployed, or you can become separated and you could be rotated into the non-participation. So that's the value function of the worker. This is the value function of the unemployed person. So again, I have to ask the question when I look at the flow, what is it that they bring to the household, the unemployed person? And what they bring is Well, they just bring their unemployment check from the government, and there's no, the households don't participate in the construction of home goods, so that's it. That's the only thing that's in that value function. And then finally, there's the value function of the non-participating people. What do they bring to the home? Well, it's the value marginal product of what they do in producing the home consumption, which is I'm writing it out as VPNP. It has to be written, it involves the multiplier on home consumption divided by some convert this into consumption units. So these are the value functions of all these characters, and they play a role in the alternating offer bargaining. Okay. Yeah. So there's people constantly bleeding from the labor market into the home, and then the home decides how many people to push back. So you have an endogeneity. Here, this E is the probability that a non-employed person gets into the labor market, and that's a choice variable of the household. But S is exogenous. Now, we know, of course, how to make all of those things endogenous. S, the persistence of jobs. We know how to break the persistence into quit rates and finding rates and so on. What we've done here, we've tried to do is have a minimal model that allows me to talk about what it is I put on the first slide. And I feel like I can escape discussion about, I never said anything about rho, I never said anything about S, but we do have E. Okay. All right, now I'm going to put this in, I'm going to load this all into some big general equilibrium model, and it'll be, we'll have the Dixit-Stiglitz thing. I am going to have sticky prices. For sticky prices, I need people who set prices. Otherwise, I can't think of how they would be sticky. So I need price setters, have price setters any monopoly, and so that's going to generate the need for this whole system here. So I have a final good that's produced by that Stiglitz thing. The input, jth input, is produced by a monopolist. Production function involves capital and H. And H is these widgets.